is one big interconnected system in which the global north and the global south are as one. The global north needs to accept that it has been the biggest historic emitters of carbon emissions and has made fortunes at the expense of marginalized groups and poorer countries, therefore needs to take full responsibility in helping tackle climate change and climate injustice.
Climate change refers to a long-term shift in temperatures and weather patterns. Anthropogenic global warming is caused by the burning of fossil fuels, which release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The properties within these greenhouse gases absorb radiation, which make the atmosphere warmer. In 1938, Guy Callendar first discovered the world was warming by collecting world temperature measurements and suggested this warming was related to carbon dioxide emissions. The world is now about 1.2 degrees warmer than it was in the 19th century, and the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen to 50% higher than it was during the Industrial Revolution, and continue to increase, and as a result risk further sea level rising, extreme weather, loss of biodiversity, mass extinction of species, food scarcity, and poverty for millions of people around the world. Global North are historically, politically, and financially responsible for the climate crisis and hold full responsibility to act rapidly and carry more burden as they were able to grow their economy without restraint. They became rich through burning of fossil fuels and industrial production, thus having the largest historical footprint. However, as the West transferred their emissions to the global South by shifting their industrial production to developing countries like India and China for cheap labor in the late 20th century, the blame for the climate crisis is now being shifted to the global South. Currently, China is the biggest emitter of fossil fuel CO2 emissions, accounting for 30.64% of the global emissions in 2020, as they are undergoing its industrial revolution. Much of the blame is being placed on developing countries like China and India. However, historically, the global North are highly responsible for the climate crisis, as they account for 92% of the excess global CO2 emissions since the 18th century. The transition into modernity and the advent of industrial society and industrial civilization led to the current climate emergency. The ongoing attempts to try and deal with climate change have been a failure. The 1960s and the 1970s experienced large-scale industrial pollution, threats of nuclear radiation, mass destruction of entire ecosystems around the globe, which led to the widespread international concern about the global environmental crisis and concerns related to the human environment, which led to a series of global meetings being held regarding issues related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and to protect the environment. Global governance dealing with the climate crisis has fundamentally been a failure. The United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, held in Stockholm in June 1972, was the first world conference held to address the environmental concern. It adopted a declaration that set out principles for the preservation and enhancements of human survival, but was an ultimate failure as the agreements made were not legally binding nor agreed upon commitments to make real change. Furthermore, it heightened tensions between the developed and the developing world through debating as to who should take responsibility for the world's environmental problems. Though the conference did warn the government of activities related to climate change did not become a central preoccupation of these bodies until 1992 with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Rio Conference paved the way for Kyoto Protocols in 1997, linked to UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which attempted to limit global emissions. It set its members legally binding targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the time when the developed countries were responsible for 55% of the total emissions, mainly from fossil fuel combustion and deforestation. The Kyoto Protocol was largely a failure. The US, the world's largest economy, who was responsible for 36% of the total emissions, at the time withdrew, it also did not compel developing countries like China and India, who were highly increasing their carbon emissions, to take action. The global climate negotiations in recent times have been carried out through the Paris Climate Accords held in Paris in December 2015. 196 parties signed the Paris Agreement, a legally binding framework required all countries to set emission reduction pledges and communicate every 5 years what actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gases through nationally determined contributions. Finally, COP26 failed to deliver any meaningful climate actions as the countries that are primarily responsible for the worsening of the climate crisis failed to meet their goals set in Paris 2015. In fact, they asked the Global South to make the sacrifices to slow their economic growth to solve a problem they did not create rather than assisting them with renewable resources and technology for them to grow both economically and sustainably. Global climate agreements have been a massive failure despite creating the structures, as national governments have sacrificed the global climate agreements for their national economic priorities and placed economic growth over the global environmental agreements. In order for these climate negotiations to work, all commitments the countries make need to be legally binding, and all the goals not reached, the countries should be faced with consequences. It has been 50 years since the first international conference, yet the climate has extremely worsened to the point where environmental catastrophe is unavoidable. Climate change has been felt disproportionately, and this is how we have come to the term climate justice.
Climate change is disproportionately felt mostly by those in the global south, in places like Bangladesh, where there has been an increase in periods of droughts, floods, and forest fires. In recent years, the term climate justice has emerged from the idea that historical polluters, US, Japan, Europe, have caused climate change and should be the ones to address it, yet it disproportionately affects the poorest and the most vulnerable. Climate justice raises voices for those who have done the least to cause climate change but are the most affected and demands equity in all climate governance by helping underrepresented voices be heard at annual summits. Climate justice movement is now gaining strength in an external influence in international negotiations. The Paris Climate Agreement recognized that climate change impacts are not distributed equally and that the poor or the indigenous people face disproportionate risk. At Paris 2015, climate justice was mentioned within these global climate negotiations for the first time. Alongside the rise of carbon emissions, deforestation is also one of the greatest factors which are impacting climate change and has real consequences on those who live in those parts, like the indigenous people. The indigenous people of Brazil are direct victims of deforestation. The Kangang are Native American people who have lived in the forest for more than 3,000 years and have created their culture and civilization around the forest, which is now being threatened due to deforestation. Juco is part of the Mataha tribe living in the Conga village in the south of Brazil. He and others like him are direct victims of deforestation.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. It's a great opportunity for us as Indigenous people to explain to the world our desires, our wishes, and our worries and fears about the earth. My name is Adraudo in Portuguese, Duco Vangfu in Kaingang. I'm graduated in social sciences and I have a master's degree in resistance and indigenous fight, and with a hint of about the knowledge of the indigenous people. Historically, it is in our blood to worry about climate change because it is directly connected to territory and biodiversity. And that affects our population entirely in a very direct way.
What does climate change mean to Juco himself?
One of the worries for us as Indigenous people is that I'm not speaking for myself. I speak for everyone, and I speak for the more than 305 peoples in Brazil. If I were to speak only for myself, I would be excluding myself from my culture because we exist as a unity. It is clear that that means genocide, I mean climate change means genocide for the plants, for the animals, and we know it is directly connected to the advances of capitalism that has started during the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and it's now affecting us, Brazil, the American continent, and it brings disaster for humanity entirely. Capitalism, to reiterate, the technological advances, the industry advancing, changing the courses of rivers and destroying biodiversity brings chaos for us as indigenous people and also for non-indigenous people. The indigenous people we are having our territories reduced because the non-indigenous are advancing upon us with the idea of evolution, and that is reducing our land and enhancing genocide.
Have the indigenous people received any funding from the Brazilian government or the United Nations for climate change, and how, if they have, like, how have they helped them, and if they haven't, how haven't they helped them?
Up to 2 years ago, from our very own interests and desires, we've had protests in Europe and requests to other countries in Europe to interfere because we understand that there is a group of countries that worry about climate change and worry about what's been going on in Brazil. Especially in the south of the country, there is something happening. There's something happening of monoculture, exporting soy to the rest of the world, and that excessive use of soil has direct effects on climate change, as well as the deforestation of the Amazon forest and illegal mining. And it is supported by the law that the government has to keep an eye on it, to fiscalize it, but instead they've been overlooking what's been happening because they are only worried about putting money in people's pockets. There is an ethnic genocide happening in the whole country for the excessive use of soil. The current government does not care and instead relaxes the grip on the rules that were there in the first place to defend the climate. And they're doing it in the name of seeking evolution and seeking more money and enriching people. And as a consequence, we as indigenous people suffer.
The indigenous population are at a higher risk of being affected by climate change due to discrimination, social exclusion, land dispossession, and mainly due to neglect. Many species, indigenous plants and animals have been and will be lost, which ruin and affect the balance of the ecosystem alongside the indigenous people. The demand for agricultural products in the global north has led to mass deforestation in many countries like Brazil, and this colonial system needs to be changed in order to combat the current climate crisis. The climate justice movement recognizes that the climate crisis is bigger than just a scientific problem and has been extremely successful in raising awareness for those who are disproportionately impacted from climate change. The harsh reality of climate change is that the poorer countries and the marginalized people, which contribute the least to the problem, stand to lose the most from rapid climate change. The developing world and the marginalized people are and will be hit the hardest by food insecurities, conflicts of resources, and large climate refugee movement. The only way to limit the rapid climate change is to decrease emissions, stop deforestation, and use more renewable energy, and meet the net zero targets by the end of the decade, not 2050 as suggested at the Paris Climate Accords. Everyone is responsible for climate change and needs to do their bit. However, historically, the developed world has carried out more greater damage than the global south, thus should take on more burden.